Assalamualaikum teman-teman semua. Perkenalkan, kami dari kelompok 2 Hukum Internasional kelas B Fakultas Hukum Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta. Kami akan menampilkan video simulasi persidangan di acara internasional. Pada kali ini, kami memilih sengketa antara negara Malaysia dengan Singapura perihal Pulau Batu Puteh. Berikut anggota dari kelompok kami beserta peran-perannya.
The court meets today to hear all arguments of the parties in the case of Pedra Branca dispute. International conflict is an inevitable aspect of international relations. Territorial dispute is a part of that and is heavily connected to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state. This is more or less the case with Pedra Branca, Pulau Batu Puteh, Middle Rocks, and South Ledge. The position of Pedra Branca made the island a serious navigational hazard on an important international trade route. Middle Rocks and South Ledge were also disputed along with Pedra Branca, as all the three islands are close by. These three islands were disputed between Singapore and Malaysia since the location of the islands is nearby the territorial waters of both countries. As the dispute could then be settled bilaterally, Singapore and Malaysia agreed to refer the dispute to the International Court of Justice. ICJ as an international organization could resolve the dispute and provide a decisive and binding judgment based on international law. Its jurisdiction is carefully defined in order to preserve the sovereignty of the states who are involved in the dispute. Through the mediation of ICJ, Singapore and Malaysia are able to settle this dispute peacefully.
Points of agreement and disagreement. First, so far as the present dispute is concerned, Malaysia and Singapore are respectively successor to the legal possession of Johor, on the one hand, and of Great Britain in right of Singapore on the other hand. Second, Johor was a substantial kingdom originally located north and south of the Singapore Strait, with which the British and the other powers conducted political relations. Third, before the Crawford Treaty of 1824, Johor's sovereignty extended to Singapore Island itself, and other islands in and around the coast, whether or not these were within 3 nautical miles of the mainland. Four, Johor ceded Singapore Island, another island, within 10 nm to Great Britain. But that treaty did not result in a cession of Pulau Batu Puteh or Pedra Branca. 5. Horseberg Light was constructed and operated as a lighthouse for the purpose of assisting mariners, and continued to be so operated when the present dispute broke out in 1980. 6. The parties also agree that this is the critical date for the purpose of this case. I have invited the delegation for both parties, and I now invite for the delegation to present argument of delegation. Why does Malaysia claim Pedra Branca on the map of Malaysia? Is this lighthouse managed by Singapore on the island is under Singaporean control over the island, which theoretically strengthens Singapore claim? To Malaysia delegation, the time is yours.
Okay, Malaysia argues that Johor has initial ownership of Pedra Branca, Middle Rock, and South Ledge. Johor never gave Batu Puteh into British hands. They just gave permission to build the lighthouse and take care of it. The action of the British and Singaporeans in building and maintaining the Horsburgh Lighthouse and the waters around the island cannot be considered as acts of the island's sovereign and legal rulers. The existence of lighthouses is not all related to the sovereignty of a country but purely for the purposes of navigation. In other words, the ownership of the island was clear before the lighthouse was built, and we Malaysians reject the 1953 letter and the maps published are invalid.
Yes, Johannes. Singapore maintained that by declaring that Johor did not claim Pedra Branca, the Johor State Secretaries later had the effect of confirming Singapore's title to Pedra Branca and of confirming that Johor had no title, historic or otherwise, to the island. Moreover, Singapore states that its argument was not that Johor abandoned air or relinquished title to Pedra Branca in 1953, and that the effect of Johor's 1953 letter was to pronounce explicitly that Johor did not have a claim to ownership of Pedra Branca.
If Singapore does not claim a title based on occupation in the legal sense of that term, include occupation of terra nullius, nor does it rely on other recognized modes of acquisition. Singapore does not claim that the island was ceded in sovereignty at any time. It does not rely on acquisitive prescription. If such a doctrine exists in international law, which is the
where the act does not correspond to the law, where the territory which is the subject of the dispute is effectively administered by a state other than the one possessing the legal title. Preference should be given to the holder of the title in the event that the effectivity does not coexist with any legal title. It must invariably be taken into consideration.
So, Malaysian delegation, is there any sustainability from the Singapore authorities' side in claiming the Pedra Branca?
No further correspondence and the Singapore authorities took no public action. My Majesty, because Johor had not furnished the information requested by Singapore, Singapore chose not to proceed in this way and did not explain to the court why it abstained from acting. The lack of public action by Singapore's authorities is more difficult to understand than the lack of further correspondence. However, Singapore failed to do so, and as a result of its inaction, the status of Federanca or Pulau Puteh, far from being clarified, remains obscure.
Johannes, Singapore states that the United Kingdom and Singapore acted as operator of Horsburgh Lighthouse. Singapore over the island is strong because it relies on a letter sent by the Johor Acting State Secretary not claiming ownership of the island. Singapore argues that sovereignty over the island has been transferred to Singapore due to the consistent and continuing control of Singapore and its former colonizer, Great Britain. Evidence of this mastery includes the choice of Batu Puteh as the location for the construction of the Horsburgh Lighthouse. The judgment states that the Johor authorities and their successors took no action at all on Pedra Branca from June 1850 for the whole of the following century or more.
So, from what we hear, the conclusion is, first, Singapore did not delimit the area around PBP in its 1973 Territorial Waters Delimitation Agreement with Indonesia, despite there being only 10 nm between PBP. Second, Indonesia coastline. Third, Malaysia, on the other hand, did take action consistent with its view that it shared a maritime boundary with Indonesia only in the area of PBP. The April 1968 Petroleum Agreement between Malaysia and Continental Oil Company of Malaysia and the Indonesia-Malaysia Continental Shelf Agreement of 22nd October 1969. Fourth, Singapore never protested Malaysia action or otherwise indicated in any way that it considered that it had maritime boundary in the area of PBP consistent with sovereignty of the islands. Fifth, the consistent practice of the United Kingdom and the United States government in the placing of maritime boundary lines on official maps of the area was to place PBP in Malaysian waters. So, the final verdict is Pedra Branca belongs to Singapore. In the other hand, Middle Rocks belong to Malaysia, but South Ledge doesn't belong to both of the countries because the island is formed by colors smaller than the middle rocks and the tides that make it the island sink and appear many times.